Okay, so what typically happens once the Jenkins installation gets through is it'll start installing itself, and there are some small checks that needs to be done. So, and by default, Jenkins launches on the port 8080. So let me just open up localhost 8080. There's a small checking that will be done as a part of the installation process, wherein I need to type in a hash key. All right. So there's a very, very simple hash key that gets stored out here. So I'll have to just copy this path. If at all you're running as a WAR file, you would see that in your logs. All right. So this is a simple hash key that gets created every time when you do a Jenkins installation. So as a part of the installation, it just asks you to do this. So if that is not correct, it will crib about it, but this looks good. So it's going ahead. All right. One important part during the installation. So you would need to install some recommended plugins. What happens is the plugins are all related to each other. So it's like the typical RPM kind of a problem where you try to install some plugin and it's got a dependency which is not installed, and you get into all those issues. In order to get rid of that, what Jenkins recommends, there's a bunch of plugins that is already recommended. So just go ahead and blindly click that install recommended plugin. So if you see, there is a whole lot of plugins which are bare essential plugins that is required for Jenkins in order to run properly. So Jenkins, as a part of the installation, would get all these plugins and then install it for you. This is a good combination to kind of begin with. And mind you, at this moment, Jenkins needs lots of bandwidth in terms of network. So in case your network is not so good, few of these plugins would kind of fail. And these plugins are all available on openly or mirrored sites, and sometimes some of them may be down. So do not worry in case some of these plugins kind of fail to install. You'd get an option to kind of retry installing them, but just ensure that at least most or 90-95% of all these plugins are installed without any problems. Let me pause the video here for a minute and then get back once all these plugins are installed. My plugin installation is all good. There was no failures in any of my plugins. So after that, I get to create this first admin user. Again, this is one important point that you got to remember. Give in any username and password, but ensure that you kind of remember that, because it's very hard to get back your username and password in case you forget it. All right, so I'm going to create a very, very simple username and password, something that I can remember. That's my name, and an email ID is kind of optional, but it doesn't allow me to go ahead in case I don't. So I just give in an admin and I got a password. I remember my password. This is my full name. All right, I say save and finish. All right, that kind of completed my Jenkins installation. It was not that tough, was it? Now that I have my Jenkins installed correctly, let me quickly walk you through some bare minimal configurations that is required. These are kind of a first time configuration that is required. So, and also let me warn you, the UI is little hard for many people to wrap their head around it, specifically the Windows guys. But if at all you're a Java guy, you know how painful it is to write UI in Java, you will kind of appreciate, all the effort that has gone into the UI. Bottom line, UI is little hard to, wrap your head around it. But once you start using it, possibly you'll start liking it. All right. So let me get into something called as Manage Jenkins. This can be viewed like a main menu for all Jenkins configuration. So I'll get into some of those important ones. Something called as Configure System. Configure System. This is where you kind of put in the configuration for your complete Jenkins instance. Few things to kind of look out for. This is a home directory. This is a Java home, where all the configurations, all the workspace, anything and everything regarding Jenkins is stored out here. System message, you want to put in some message on the system, you just type in whatever you want and it's possibly show up somewhere up here on the menu. Number of executors, very, very important configuration. This just lets Jenkins know at any point in time how many jobs or how many threads can be run. You can kind of visualize it like a thread that can be run on this particular instance. As a thumb rule, if at all you're on a single core system, number of executors 2 should be good enough. In case at any point in time, if there are multiple jobs that kind of get triggered at the same time, in case the number of executors are less compared to the number of jobs that have woken up, no need to panic, because they will all get queued up and eventually Jenkins will get to running those jobs. Just bear in mind that whenever a new job kind of gets triggered, the CPU usage and the memory usage in terms of the disk write is very high on the Jenkins instance. So that's something that you got to kind of keep in mind. All right, but number of executors, 2 for my system is kind of good. Label for my Jenkins, I don't want any of these things. Usage, how do you want to use your Jenkins? This is good for me because I only have a primary server that is running. So I want to use this node as much as possible. Quiet period. Each of these options have got some bare minimal help kind of a thing that is out here. By clicking on these question marks, you will get to know as to what are these particular configurations. All right, so this all look good. What I want to show you here is there's something regarding the Docker, timestamps, Git plugin, SVN, email notifications. I don't want that. What I want yes, I want this SMTP server configuration. Remember, I mentioned earlier that I would want Jenkins to be sending out some emails. And what I've done here is I've just configured the SMTP details of my personal email ID. In case you're in an organization, you would have some sort of an email IDs that is set up for a Jenkins server. So you can specify the SMTP server details of your company so that you can authorize Jenkins to kind of send out emails. But in case you want to try it out like me, I have configured my personal email ID, which is on my Gmail, for sending out notifications. So the SMTP server would be smtp.gmail.com. I'm using the SMTP authentication. I've provided my email ID and my password. I'm using the SMTP port, which is 465, and reply to address is the same as mine. I can just send out an email and see if at all this configuration works. Again, Gmail would not allow anybody to send out notifications on your behalf. So you'll have to lower the security level of your Gmail ID so that you can allow programmatically somebody to send out email notifications on your behalf. So I've done already that. I'm just trying to see if I can send a test email with the configurations that I've set in. Yes. All right. So the email configuration looks good. So this is how you configure your Gmail account in case you want to do that. If not, put in your organization SMTP server details, which are with a valid username and password, and it should all be set. All right. So no other configurations that I'm going to change here. All of these look good. All right. So I come back to manage Jenkins. Okay. One other thing that I want to kind of go over is the global tool configuration. Imagine this scenario, or look at it this way. Jenkins is a continuous integration server. It doesn't know what kind of a code base it's going to pull in, what kind of a tool set that is required, or what is the code that it's going to pull in and how is it going to build. So you would have to put in all the tools that is required for building the appropriate kind of code that you're going to pull in from your source code repositories. So just to give an example, in case your source code is a Java source code, and assuming that because in this demo, this is my laptop and I've put in all the configurations, JDK, everything on my laptop because I'm a developer, I'm working on the laptop. But my continuous integration server would be a separate server without anything being installed on it. So in case I want Jenkins to run a Java code, I would need to install JDK on it. I need to specify the JDK location of this out here this way. Okay, since I already have the JDK installed and I've already put in the Java home directory, or rather the environment variable correctly, I don't need to do it. Git, if at all I want the Jenkins server to use Git, Git is the command bash or the command prompt for running Git and connecting to any other Git server. So you would need Git to be installed on that particular system and set the path accordingly. Gradle and Maven, if at all you have some Mavens as well, you want to do this. Any other tool that you're going to install on your system, which is your continuous integration server, you will have to come in here and configure something. In case you don't configure it, when Jenkins runs, it will not be able to find these tools for building your task and it'll crib about it. That's good. I don't want to save anything. Manage Jenkins. Let me see what else is required. Yes, configure global security. All right, the security is enabled. And if you see by default, it's the security access control is set to Jenkins own user database. So what does this mean? Jenkins by default, it uses file system where it stores all the usernames, which hashes up these usernames and kind of stores them. So as of now, Jenkins is configured to use its own database. Assuming that you are running in an organization, you would probably want to have a, some sort of an AD or an LDAP server using which you would want to control access to your Jenkins repository, rather Jenkins tool. So you would specify your LDAP server details, the root DN, password or the manager DN and the manager password and all these details in case you want to connect your Jenkins instance with your LDAP or AD or any of the authentication servers that you have in your organization. But for now, since I don't have any of these things, I'm going to use this own database. That's good enough. All right. So I will set up some authorization methods and stuff like that once I put in few jobs. So for now, let me not get into any of these details of this. Just be aware that Jenkins can be connected for authorization to an LDAP server, or you can have Jenkins managing its own servers, which is happening as of now. So I'm going to save all this stuff. That's good for me. So enough of all these configurations. Let me put in a very, very simple job. All right. So job, new item, little difficult to kind of figure out, but then that's the new item. So I'll just say, first job, this is good for me. I just give a name for my job. I would say it's a freestyle project. That's good enough for me. I don't want to choose any of that. So unless until you choose any of this particular button would not become active. So choose the freestyle project and say, okay. At a very high level, you would see general source code management, build triggers, build environment, build and post build. In case you install more and more plugins, you will see a lot more options. But for now, this is what you would see. So what am I doing? At the moment, I'm just putting up a very, very simple job. And the job could be anything and everything. So I don't want to put in a very complicated job for now. For the demo purpose, let me just put in a very, very simple job. I'll give a description. This is an optional thing. This is my first Jenkins job. All right. I don't want to choose any of these. Again, there are some helps available here. I don't want to choose any of this. I don't want to connect it into any source code for now. I don't want any triggers for now. I'll come back to this in a while. Build environment. I don't want any build environment. As a part of this build step, I just want to, run few things so that I kind of complete this particular job. So since I'm on a Windows box, I would say execute Windows batch command. All right. So what do you want to do? Let me just echo something. Echo, hello. This is my first Jenkins job, and possibly I would want the date and the timestamp pertaining to the job. I mean, the date and time in which this job was run. All right. Very, very simple command that says, this is my first job. It just puts out something along with the date and the time. All right. I don't want to do anything else. I want to keep this job as simple as this. So let me save this job. All right. So once I save this job, the job names comes up here, and then I need to build this job. And you would see some build history out here. Nothing is there as of now because I've just put in a job. I've not run it yet. All right. So let me try to build it now. You see a build number, you would see a date and a timestamp. So if I click on this, you would see a console output. If I go here, okay, as simple as that. And where is all the job details that is getting into? If you see this, if I navigate to this particular directory, all right, so this is the directory what I was mentioning earlier regarding Jenkins home. So all the job related stuff that is specific to this particular Jenkins installation is all here. All the plugins that is installed, the details of each of those plugins can be found here. All right, so the workspace is where all the jobs that I've created, whichever I'm running, there will be individual folders specific to the jobs that has been put up here. All right, so one job, one quick run. That's what it looks like. Pretty simple. Okay, let me do one thing. Let me put up a second job. I would say second job. I would say freestyle project. All right, this is my second job. I just want to demonstrate the powerfulness of the automation server and how simple it is to automate a job that is put up on Jenkins, which will be triggered automatically. Remember what I said earlier about Jenkins, because at the core of Jenkins is a very, very powerful automation server. All right, so what I'm going to do, I will just keep everything else the same I'm going to put in a build script pretty much similar to second job that gets triggered automatically every minute. All right, let me do that. Percentage date, and I'll put in the time. All right. So I just put in another job called second job, and it pretty much does the same thing as what I was doing earlier in terms of printing the date and the time. But this time, I'm just going to demonstrate the powerfulness of the automation server that is there. If you see here, there's a build trigger. So a build can be triggered using various triggers that is there. So we'll get into this GitHub triggering or hook or a webhook kind of a triggering later on. But for now, what I want to do, I want to ensure that this job that I'm going to put in would be automatically triggered on its own. Let's say every minute, I want this job to be run on its own. So build periodically is my setting. If you see here, there's a bunch of help that is available for me. So for those of you who have written cron jobs on Linux boxes, you'll find it very, very simple. But for others, don't panic. Let me just put up a very, very simple regular expression for scheduling this job every minute. All right, so that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. All right, come up, come up, come up. All right, so 5 stars is all that I'm going to put in. And Jenkins got a little worried and he's asking me, do you really mean every minute? Oh yeah, I want to do this every minute. Let me save this. And how do I check whether it gets triggered every minute or not? I just don't do anything. I'll just wait for a minute. And if at all everything goes well, Jenkins would automatically trigger my second job in a minute's time from now. This time around, I'm not going to trigger anything. Look, there you see. It's automatically got triggered. If I go in here, yep, second job that gets triggered automatically. It was triggered at 1642, which is 4:42 my time. That looks good. And if everything goes well, every 1 minute onwards, this job would be automatically triggered. Now that I have my Jenkins up and running, a few jobs that has been put up here on my Jenkins instance, I would need a way of controlling access to my Jenkins server. This is wherein I would use a plugin called role-based access plugin and create few rules. The rules are something like a global role and a project role, project specific role. I can have different roles and I can have users who have signed up or the users whom I create kind of assigned to these roles so that each of these users fall into some category. This is my way of kind of controlling access to my Jenkins instance and ensuring that people don't do something unwarranted. All right, so first things first, let me go ahead and install a plugin for doing that. So I get into manage Jenkins and manage plugin. A little bit of a confusing screen in my opinion. There is updates available, installed and advanced. As of now, we don't have the role-based plugin. So let me go to available. It'll take some time for it to get refreshed. All right, now these are the available plugins. These are the installed plugins. All right, so let me come back to available and I would want to search for my role-based access plugin. So I would just search for role and hit enter. Okay, role-based authorization strategy enables user authorization using a role-based strategy. Roles can be defined globally or for particular jobs or nodes and stuff like that. So exactly, this is the plugin that I want. I would want to install it without a restart. All right, looks good so far. Yes. Go back to the top of the page. Yes. Remember, Jenkins is running on a Java using a Java instance. So typically many things would work the same way unless and until you want to restart Jenkins once in a while. But as a good practice, whenever you do some sort of a big installations or big patches on your Jenkins instance, just ensure that you kind of restart it. Otherwise, there would be a difference in terms of what is installed on the system and what is there on the file system. You would need to flush out few of those settings later on. But for now, these are all very small plugins, so these would run without any problems. But otherwise, if at all there are some plugins which would need a restart, kindly go ahead and restart your Jenkins instance. But for now, I don't need that. It looks good. I've installed the plugin. So where do I see my plugin? I installed the plugin that is specific to the user control or the access control. So Let me go into, yes, global security, and I would see this role-based strategy showing up now. All right, so this comes in because of my installation of my role-based plugin. So this is what I would want to enable, because I already have my own database set up. And for the authorization part, in the sense that who can do what, I'm going to install. I mean, I've already installed a role-based strategy plugin, and I'm going to enable that strategy. All right, I would say save. Okay, now I've installed the role-based access plugin. I would need to just set it up and check that, I would go ahead and create some roles and ensure that I assign users as per these roles. All right, so let me go to Manage Jenkins, configure. All right, let me see, where is this? Configure global security. Is that where I create my roles? Nope, not here. Yes, manage and assign roles. Okay. Again, you would see these options only after you install these plugins. So for now, I've just enabled the plugin. I've enabled role-based access control, and I would go ahead and create some roles for this particular Jenkins instance. So I would say first, manage roles. So I would need to create some roles here, and the roles are at a very high level. These are global roles, and there are some project roles, and there are some slave roles. I'll not get into details of all of these. At a very, very high level, which is a global role, let me just create a role. A role can be kind of visualized like a group. So I would create a role called developer. Typically, the Jenkins instance or the CA instance are kind of owned up or controlled by QA guys. So QA guys would need to provide some sort of limited access to developers. So that's why I'm creating a role called developer, and I'm adding this role at a global role level. So I would say add this here, and you would see this developer role that is there. And each of these options, if you hover over it, you would see some sort of a help on what are these permissions specific to. So what I want is, like, it sounds a little different, but I would want to give very, very little permissions for the developer. So from an administration perspective, I would just want him to have a read kind of a role. Credentials, again, I would just want a view kind of a role. I don't want him to create any agents and all that stuff. That's looks good for me. For a job, I would want him to just possibly read. I don't want him to build. I don't want him to cancel any jobs. I don't want him to configure any job. I don't even want him to create any job. I would just want him to read few things. I would not give him possibly a role to the workspace as well. I mean, I don't want him to have access to the workspace. I would just want him to read a job or check, have read-only access to the job. Run. No, I don't want him to give him any particular access which will allow him to run any jobs. View, configure, yeah, possibly create, yeah. Delete, I don't want. Read, yes, definitely. And this is the specific role. So what I'm doing, I'm just creating a global role called developer, and I'm giving him very, very limited roles, in the sense that I don't want this developer to be able to run any agents, nor create jobs, or build jobs, or cancel jobs, or configure jobs. At the max, I would just want him to read a job that is already put up there. Okay, so I would save. Now I've created a role. I still don't have any users that is there on the system. So let me go ahead and create some user on the system. That's not here. I would say configure, manage Jenkins, manage users. Okay, let me create a new user. I would call this user as, yeah, developer one sounds good. Some password that I can remember. Okay, his name is developer one, d@d.com or something like that. Okay, so this is the admin with which I kind of configured or brought up the system, and developer one is a user that I have configured. So still have not set any roles for this particular user yet. So I would go to manage Jenkins. I would say manage and assign roles. I would say assign roles. Okay, so if you see, what I'm going to do now is assign a role that is specific to that particular developer. I will find the particular user and assign him the developer role that I've already configured. the role shows up here, I would need to find my user, whoever created, and then assign him to that particular role. So if you remember, the user that I created was developer 1. I would add this particular user, and now this particular user, what kind of a role I want him to have, because this is the global role that I had created. So developer, I would assign this developer 1 to this particular global role, and I would go ahead and save my changes. Now let me check the permissions of this particular user by logging out of my admin account and logging back as developer 1. If you remember, this role was created with very less privileges. So there you go. I have Jenkins, but I don't see a new item. I can't trigger a new job. I can't do anything. I see these jobs. However, I don't think so I'll be able to start this job. I don't have the permission set for that. The maximum I can do is look at the job, see what was there as a part of the console output and stuff like that. So this is a limited role that was created, and I added this developer to that particular role, which was a developer role, so that the developers don't get to configure any of the jobs, because the Jenkins instance is owned by a QA person. He doesn't want to give developer any administrative rights. So the rights that he set out by creating a developer role, and anybody who is tagged, any user who is tagged as a part of this developer role would get the same kind of permissions. And these permissions can be, fine grained. It can be a project specific permissions as well. But for now, I just demonstrated the high level permission that I had set in. Let me quickly log out of this user and get back as the admin user, because I need to continue with my demo. With the developer role that was created, I have very, very less privileges. One of the reasons for Jenkins being so popular, as I mentioned earlier, is the bunch of plugins that is provided by users or community users who don't charge any money for these plugins, but it's got plugins for connecting anything and everything. So if you can navigate to, or if you can find Jenkins plugins, you would see index of over so many plugins that is there. All of these are wonderful plugins. Whatever connectors that you would need, if you want to connect Jenkins to an AWS instance, or you want to connect Jenkins to a Docker instance, or any of those containers, you would have a plugin. You can go and search up. If I want to connect Jenkins to Bitbucket, Bitbucket is one of the Git servers. There's so many plugins that is available. Okay, so bottom line, Jenkins without plugins is nothing. So plugins is the heart of Jenkins. For you to connect, or in order to connect Jenkins with any of the containers or any of the other tool sets, you would need the plugins. If you want to connect, or you want to build a repository which has got Java and Maven, you would need to install Maven and JDK on your Jenkins instance. If at all you're looking for a .NET build or a Microsoft build, you would need to have MS Build installed on your Jenkins instance, and the plugins that will trigger MS Build. If at all you want to listen to some server-side webhooks from GitHub, you would need GitHub specific plugins. If you want to connect Jenkins to AWS, you need those plugins. If you want to connect to a Docker instance that is running anywhere in the world, as long as you have the URL which is publicly reachable, you just have a Docker plugin that is installed on your Jenkins instance. SonarQube is one of the popular static code analyzers. So you can connect a Jenkins build, you can build a job on Jenkins and push it to SonarQube, and get SonarQube to run analysis on that and get back the results in Jenkins. All of these works very well because of the plugins. Now with that, let me connect our Jenkins instance to GitHub. I already have a very, very simple Java repository up on my GitHub instance. So let me connect Jenkins to this particular GitHub instance and pull out a job that is put up there. All right. So this is my very, very simple, repository that is there called Hello Java. And this is what is there in the repository. There is a hello.java application that is here, or a simple class file that is there. It's got just one line of system.out. So this is already present on github.com at this place, and this would be the URL for this repository. If I pick up the HTTPS URL, this is my HTTPS URL. So what I would do is I would connect my Jenkins instance to go to GitHub, provide my credentials, and pull out this repository which is on the cloud hosted github.com, and get it to my Jenkins instance, and then build this particular Java file. I'm keeping the source code very, very simple. It's just a Java file. How do I build my Java file? How do I compile my Java file? I just say Java C and the name of my class file, which is hello.java. And how do I run my Java file? I would say Java and hello. Okay, so remember, I don't need to install any plugins now because what it needs is a Git plugin. So if you remember when we were doing the installation, there was a bunch of recommended plugins. So Git is already installed on my system, so I don't need to install it again. So let me put up a new job here. It says Git job. Let it be a freestyle project. That's good for me. I would say okay. All right, so the source code management. Remember in the earlier examples, we did not use any source code because we were just putting up some echo kind of jobs. We did not need any integration with any of the source code systems. So now let me connect this. So I'm going to put up a source code and Git would show up because the plugin is already there. SVN, Perforce, any of those additional source code management tools, if at all you would need, just install those plugins and Jenkins connects wonderfully well to all these particular source control tools. Okay, so I would copy the HTTPS URL from here. I would say this is the URL that I'm supposed to go and grab my source code from. But all right, that sounds good. But what is the username and password? So I'll have to specify a username and password. All right, so I would say the username, this is my username, and this is my HTTPS credential for my job. Okay, so this is my username and this is my password. I just save this. I say add, and then I would say, use these credentials to go to GitHub and then on my behalf, pull out a repository. All right. If at all at this stage, if there's any error in terms of Jenkins not able to find Git or the git.exe, or if my credentials are wrong, somewhere down here you would see a red message saying that, something is not right. You can just go ahead and kind of fix that. For now, this looks good for me. I'm going to grab this URL. What am I going to do? This step would pull the source code from the GitHub. And then what would be there as a part of my build step? Because this repository just has a Java file, correct? Hello.java. So in order for me to build this, I would just say execute Windows batch command and I would say Java C hello.java. That is the way I would build my Java code. And if I have to run it, I would just say Java hello. Pretty simple, 2 steps, and this would run after the repository contents are fetched from GitHub. So Java C, Java, that sounds good. I would say save this and let me try to run this. Okay, if you see, there's a lot of, it executes Git on your behalf. It goes out here, it provides my credentials and says, it pulls all my repository, and by default, it will pull up the master branch that is there on my repository. And it kind of builds this whole thing, Java C hello.java, and it runs this project Java hello. And there you see, this is the output that is there. And if at all you want to look at the contents of the repository, if you can go here, this is my workspace of my system. Hang on, this is not right. Okay, Git job. If you see here, this is my hello.java. This is the same program that was there on my GitHub repository. Okay, so this is a program that was there on my GitHub repository. All right, so this was the same program that was here, and Jenkins on our behalf went over all the way to GitHub, pulled this repository from there, and then it brought it down to my local system on my Jenkins instance. It compiled it and it ran this particular application. Okay, now that I've integrated Jenkins successfully with GitHub for a simple Java application, let me build a little bit on top of it. What I will do is I have a Maven based web application that is up there as a repository in my GitHub. So this is the repository that I'm talking about. It's called MVN Web App. It's a Maven based repository. As you would know, Maven is a very simple Java based build tool that will allow you to run various targets, and it'll compile. It will, based upon the goals that you specify, it can compile, it can run some tests, and it can build a WAR file and even deploy it into some other server. For now, what we're going to use Maven is just for building and creating a package out of this particular web application. It contains a bunch of things, and what is important is just the index.jsp. It just contains an HTML file that is there as a part of this web application. So from a perspective of requirements, now since I'm going to connect Jenkins with this particular repository, Git, we already have that set. We only need 2 other things. One is Maven, because Jenkins will use Maven. So in order to use Maven, Jenkins would have to have a Maven installation that is there on the Jenkins box. And in this case, the Jenkins box is this laptop. And after I have my Maven installed, I also need a Tomcat server. Tomcat is a very, very simple web server that you can freely download. I'll let you know how to quickly download and install the Tomcat. All right, so download Maven first. There are various ways in which you can kind of download this Maven. There is zip files, binary zip files, and archive files. So what I've done is I've just already downloaded Maven, and if you see, I've unzipped it here. So this is the folder with which I've unzipped my Maven. So as you know, Maven again is a one open source build tool. So you'll have to set in a few configurations and set up the path. So mvn hyphen version, if I specify this, after I set in my path, Maven should work. And if at all I echo m2 home, which is nothing but the variable environment variable specific to Maven home, it is already set here. So once you unzip Maven, just set this m2 home variable to the directory where you unzipped your Maven. Also, just set the path to this particular directory /bin because that is where your Maven executables are all found. All right, so that's with Maven. And since I've set the path and the environment variable Maven is running perfectly fine on my system, I've just verified it. Okay, next one is the Tomcat server. Download Apache Tomcat server 8.5 is what I have on my system. So I'm just going to show you where to download this from. This is where you download Tomcat server, and I already have the server downloaded. Again, this doesn't need any installation. I just unzip it here and it kind of has a bin and configuration. I've made some subtle changes in the configuration. First and foremost, Tomcat server also by default runs on port 8080. Since we already have our Jenkins server running on port 8080, we cannot let Tomcat run on the same port. There will be a port clash. So what I've done, I have configured Tomcat to use a different port. So if I go to this configuration file here, there is a server.xml. Let me open this up here. All right. Okay. So this is the port. By default, it will be 8080. I've just modified it to 8081. So I've changed the port on which my Tomcat server would run. All right. So that is one change. Second change, when Jenkins kind of tries to get into my Tomcat and deploy something for someone, he would need some authentications so that he'll be allowed deployment by Tomcat. So for that, I need to create a user on Tomcat and provide this user credentials to my Jenkins instance. So I would go to Tomcat users.xml file here. I've already created a username called deployer and the password is deployer, and I've added a role called manager-script. Manager-script will allow programmatic access to the Tomcat server. So this is the role that is there. So using this credentials, I will enable or I'll empower Jenkins to get into my Tomcat server and deploy my application. All right, only these two things that is required. Let me just start my Tomcat server first. So I get into my bin folder, I open a command prompt here, and there's a startup.bat. It's pretty fast. It just takes a few seconds. Yes, there you go. Tomcat server is up and running. Now this is running on port 8081. So let me just check if that looks good. So localhost 8081. Okay, my Tomcat server is up and running. That sounds good. The user is already configured on this. That's also fine. So what I'll do as a part of my first job, Maven is also installed on my system. So I'm good to use Maven as a part of my Jenkins. So I will put up a simple job now. I will say job, mvn, web app. I'll call this freestyle job. That's good. Okay, so this will be a Git repository. What is the URL of my Git repository? Is this guy, HTTPS URL. Okay, that's this URL. I will use the credentials. The old credential that I set up will work well because it's the same Git user that I'm kind of connecting into. All right. So now the change happens here where after I get this, since I said this is a simple Maven repository, I will have some Maven targets to run. So the simple target first is, let me run Maven package. This creates a war file. Okay, so MVN package is the target. Package is the target. So whenever I run this package, it kind of creates it, it builds it, it tests it, and then creates a package. So this is all that is required. Maybe let me try to save this, and let me first run this and see if it connects well, if there's any problem with my WAR file, or the WAR file gets created properly. Okay, wonderful. So it built a WAR file, and if you see, it all shows you what is the location where this WAR file was generated. So this will be the workspace. If you see this, this WAR file was successfully built. Now I need to grab this particular WAR file, and then I would need to deploy it into Tomcat server. Again, I would need a small plugin to do this because I need to connect Tomcat with my Jenkins server. Let me go ahead and install the plugin for the container deployment. So I will go to Manage Plugins, Available, type in container, container, deploy to container. Okay, so this would be the plugin that I would need. I would install it without a restart. Right, seems to be very fast. Nope, sorry, it's still installing. Okay, it installed the plugin. So if at all you see this, if you go to my workspace, okay, in the target folder, I would see this web application WAR file that is already built. So I would need to configure this plugin to pull up this WAR file and deploy it onto the Tomcat server. For deploying onto the Tomcat server, I will use the credentials of the user that I've created. Okay, so let me go to configure this particular project again. And okay, all this is good. So the package is good. I'm going to just create a package. That's all fine. Now add a post build step. So after the WAR file is built as a part of this package directive, let me use this deployment to container. Now this will show up after you install the plugin. So deploy this one to the container. Now what is that you're supposed to specify? You're supposed to specify what is the location. Okay, so this is a global configuration that is there that will allow you to, from the root folder, it will pick up the WAR file that is there. So ***star.war, that's good for me. Okay, what is the context path? Context path is nothing but just the name of an application that, under which it will get deployed into the Tomcat server. I will just say MVN web app. That's the name of my thing. Now I need to specify what kind of a container that I'm talking about. All right, so the deployment would be for this Tomcat 8.5 is what I need. Okay, because the server that we have is a Tomcat 8.5 server that I have. So this would be the URL. So the credentials, yes, I need to add a credential for this particular server. So if you remember, I had created a credential for my web application. So let me just find that. My Tomcat server, yes, configuration of this. Okay, so deployer and deployer. Username is deployer, password is deployer. Okay, so let me use that credential. I would say add a new credential, Jenkins credential. The username is deployer and the password is deployer. So I would use this deployer credentials for that. And what is the URL of my Tomcat instance? So this is the URL of my Tomcat instance. So take the WAR file that is found in this particular folder, and then context path is mn web app. Use the deployer deployment credentials and get into this localhost, which is there 8081. This is the Tomcat server that is running on my system, and then go ahead and deploy it. Okay, so that is all that is required. So I would say just save this and let me run it now. Okay, it successfully built the WAR file. It is trying to deploy it, and looks like the deployment went ahead perfectly well. So The context path was MVN web app. So if I type in this, or if at all I go ahead into my Tomcat server, there would be a web apps folder. You would see the the date timestamp. So this is the file that got recently copied, and this is the Explorer version of our application. So the application was built, the source code of this application was pulled from the GitHub server. It was built locally on the Jenkins instance, and then it was pushed into a Tomcat server, which is running on a different port, which is 80881. Now for this demo, I'm running everything locally on my system, but assuming that, this particular Tomcat instance was running on some other server with some other different IP address, all that you got to go and change is the URL of the server. So this would be the server in case you already have that, if you have a Tomcat server which is running on some other machine, that's all fine. With a different IP, that's all good enough. The whole bundle or the war file that was built as a part of this Jenkins job gets transferred onto the other server and gets deployed. That's the beauty of Jenkins and automatic deployments, or other deployments using Jenkins and Maven. Distributed build or master slave configuration in Jenkins. As you would have seen, we just have one instance of Jenkins server up and running all the time. And also I told you that whenever any job that kind of, gets started on the Jenkins server, it is little heavy on in terms of disk space and the CPU utilization. So which kind of, if at all you're in an organization wherein you're heavily reliant on the Jenkins server, you don't want your Jenkins server to go down. So that's wherein you kind of start distributing the load that is there on the Jenkins server. So you primarily have a server, which is just a placeholder or like a master who will take in all the kind of jobs. And what he'll do is based upon trigger that has happened to the job or whichever job needs to be built, if at all, he can delegate these jobs onto some other machines or some other slaves. That's a wonderful thing to have. Okay, use case 1. Use case 2, assuming that, if you have a Jenkins server that is running on a Windows box or on a Linux one, and if at all you have a need where you need to build based upon operating systems, you have multiple build configurations to support. Maybe you need to build a Windows, Windows based .NET kind of a projects where you would need a Windows machine to build this particular project. You also have a requirement where you want to build Linux based systems. You also have a Mac, you support some sort of an apps or something that is built on Mac OS. You would need to build, Mac based system as well. So how are you going to support all these needs? So that's wherein a beautiful concept of master slave or primary and delegations or agent and master comes into play. So typically you would have one Jenkins server who will just configure with all the proper authorizations, users, configurations, and everything is set up on this Jenkins server. His job is just delegations. He will listen to some sort of triggers, or based upon the job that is coming in, he will, if there is a nice way of delegating these jobs to somebody else and taking back the results, he can control a lot of other systems. And these systems may not have a complete, or there's no need to put in a complete Jenkins installation. All that you got to do is have a very, very simple runner or a slave that is a simple jar file that is run as a low priority thread or a process within these systems. So with that, you can have a wonderful distributed build server that can be set up. And in case one of the servers goes down, your master would know that what went down and kind of delegate the task to somebody else. So this is the kind of distributed build or the master slave configuration. So what I'll do in this exercise or in this demo is I will set up a simple slave. But since I don't have too many machines to kind of play around, what I'll do is I will set up a slave in one other folder within my hard drive. So I've got the C drive and D drive. My Jenkins is on my C drive. So what I would do is I would just use my E drive and set up a very, very simple slave out there. I'll just show you how to provision a slave and how to connect to a slave and how to delegate a job to that slave. Let me go back to my Jenkins master and configure him to talk to an agent. So there are various ways in which this client and server talk to each other. What I'm going to choose is something called as JNLP, Java Network Launch Protocol. So using this, I would ensure that the client and server talk to each other. So for that, I need to ensure that I kind of enable this JNLP port. So let me try to find out where is that. Let me try this. Okay, yes. Agents, and by default this JNLP agents thing would be disabled. So if you see here, there's a small help on this. So I'm going to use this JNLP, which is nothing but Java Network Launch Protocol, and I'll configure the master and server to talk to each other using JNLP. So for that I need to enable this guy. So I enable this guy instead of making by default, the configuration was disabled. So I make him random. I make him, enabled, and I say save this configuration. All right. So now I configured, or I made a setting for the master so that the JNLP port is kind of opened up. So let me go ahead and, create an agent. So I'll go to manage nodes. So if you see here, there's only one master here. So let me provision a new node here. So this is the way, in which you bring up a new node. You have to configure it on the server. Jenkins would put in some sort of security around this particular agent and let you know how to launch this particular agent so that he can connect to your Jenkins master. So I would say new node. I would give a name for my node. I would say Windows node because both of these are Windows only. So that's fine. I just give an identifier saying that Windows node. I would say this is a permanent agent. I would say, okay. So if you see the name, let me just copy this name here with the description. Number of executors, since it's a slave node and both of these are running on my system, I will keep the number of executors as 1. That's fine. Remote root directory. Now this is where, let me just clarify this, since I have both my master is running on my C drive program files 86, or hang on, not 86, C:program files. It is indeed 86. All right, Jenkins. So this is where my master is running. So I don't want the C drive. What I'll do is I'll use something called as A drive. I have another drive in my system, but please visualize this like, you're running this on a separate system altogether. So I create a folder here called Jenkins node, and this is where I'm going to place I'm going to provision my slave, and I'm going to run him from here. So this is the directory in which I'm going to provision my slave node. So I'm going to copy this here, and that is the remote root directory of your particular agent or slave. So I just copy it here. The label, probably this is fine for me. And usage, how do you want to use this guy? So I don't want him to run all kinds of jobs. I will only build jobs with label expressions that match this particular node. And so this is the label of this node. So in order for somebody to kind of delegate any task to them, they will have to specify this particular label. So imagine this way, if I have a bunch of Windows mesh system, I name it as Windows star. Anything that starts from Windows, I can give a regular expression and say that anything that matches Windows, run this particular task there. If I have some Mac machines, I name all these Mac agents as Mac star or something like that. And I can delegate all tasks, saying that start with whatever starts with Mac in this node, run the Mac jobs there. So you identify a node using the label and then delegate the task there. All right. So launch method, we will use Java Web Start because we got to use JNLP protocol. Okay, that sounds good. Directory, I think nothing else is required. Availability, yes, we'll keep this agent, yep, online as much as possible. That sounds good. All right, let me save this. All right, I'm just provisioning this particular node now. So if I click on this node, I get a bunch of commands along with an agent.jar. So this is the agent.jar that has to be taken down to the other machine or the slave node, and from there I need to run this along with a small security credential. So let me copy this whole text here in my notepad. Notepad plus plus is good for me. Okay, I copy this whole path there. I also want to download this agent.jar. I would say yes. And this agent.jar is the one that is configured by our server. So all the details that is required for launching this agent.jar is found in this. For launching this agent is found in this agent.jar. So typically I need to take this jar file onto the other system and then kind of run it from there. So I have this agent.jar. I copy this, or rather I cut this. I come back to my folder, my Jenkins node. I paste it here. Okay. So now with this provision agent.jar, and I need to use this whole command, Control A, Control C, and then launch this particular agent. So let me bring up a command prompt right here and then launch it. So I'm saying in the same folder where there is agent.jar, I'm going to launch this particular agent, java-jar, agent.jar, JNLP. This is the URL of my server. In case the server and client are on different locations or different IPs, You have to specify the IP address. All this anyway would show up, and then the secret and the root folder of your Jenkins or the slave node. Okay, so something ran, and then it says it's connected very well. It seems to have connected very well. So let me come back to my Jenkins instance and see, if at all you see earlier, this was not connected. Now let me refresh this guy. Okay, now these two guys are connected. Provision a Jenkins node, and then I copied all the credentials of the slave.jar along with the launch code, and then took it to the other system and kind of ran it from there. Since I don't have another system, I've just got a separate directory in another folder, another drive, and I'm launching the agent from here. As long as this particular agent is up and running, or this command prompt is up and running, the agent would be connected. So once I close this, the connection goes down. All right, so successfully we've launched this particular agent. Now this would be the home directory of this Jenkins node or the Jenkins slave. So any task that I'm going to delegate to this particular slave would all be run here. It will create a workspace right here. All right, so good. So let me just come back and let me kind of put up a new task here. I will say that, delegate job is good. I say freestyle project. I'm going to create a very, very simple job here. I don't want it to connect to Git or anything like that. Let me just create a very, very simple echo delegated to the slave, delegated to, I don't like the word slave, delegated to agent. Put this way. All right. So delegated to agent sounds good. Now, how am I going to ensure that this particular job runs on the agent or on the slave that I've configured? Right? Do you see this? If at all you remember how we provisioned our particular slave, we gave a label, right? So now I'm going to put in a job that will only match this particular label. So I'm going to say that whatever matches this, Windows label, run this job on that particular node. So we have only one node that's matching this, Windows node. So this job will be delegated out there. So I save this and let me build this. This is again a very, very simple job. There's nothing in this. I just want to demonstrate how to kind of delegate it to an agent. So if you see this, it ran successfully. And where is the workspace? The workspace is right inside our Jenkins node. It created a new workspace, delegated job, it put in here. So my old or my primary master job is in SQL program files under Jenkins, and this is the slave job that was successfully run. Very, very simple, but very, very powerful concept of master slave configuration or distributed build in Jenkins. Okay, approaching the final section where we've done all this hard work in bringing up our Jenkins server, configuring it, putting up some jobs on it, creating users and all this stuff. Now, we don't want this configuration to kind of go away. We want a very nice way of ensuring that we back up all this configuration. And in case there is any failure, hardware crash or a machine crash, we will want to kind of restore from the existing configuration that we kind of backed up. So one quick way to do that would be, or one dirty way to do that would be just, take a complete backup of our C program files Jenkins directory, because that's where our whole Jenkins configuration is present. But we don't want to do that. Let's use some plugins for taking up a backup. So let me go to manage Jenkins and click on available. And let me search for some backup. There are a bunch of backup plugins. So I would recommend one of these plugins that I specifically use. So this is the backup plugin. So let me go ahead and install this plugin. All right, so we went ahead and installed this plugin. So let me come back to my manage plugins. So this plugin is there. So hang on, backup manager. So you will see this option once you install this plugin. So first time I can do a setup. I would say backup this particular. I'll give a folder. This folder is pertaining to the folder where I want Jenkins to back up some data. And I would say the format should be zip format is good enough. Let me give a name or a template or a file name for my backup. This is good. I want it in verbose mode. I don't want to shut on my Jenkins, or should I shut it down? No. Okay. One thing that you got to remember is that whenever a backup happens, if there are too many jobs that is running on the server, it can kind of slow down your Jenkins instance because it's in the process of copying few of those things, and if the files are being changed at that moment, it's a little bit problematic for Jenkins. So typically you back up your servers only when there is very less load, or typically try to bring it to a shutdown kind of a state and then take a backup. All right, so I'm going to back up all these things. I don't want to exclude anything else. I want the history. I want the Maven artifacts. Possibly I don't want this guy. I would just say save, and then I would say back him up. So this would run a bunch of steps and all the files that is required as a part of this is pretty fast. But then if at all you have too many things up on your server, for now we didn't have too many things up on our server, but in case you had too many things to kind of back up, this may take a while. So let me just pause this recording and get back to you once the backup is complete. So there you go. The backup was successful. Created a backup of all the workspace, the configurations, the users, and all that. So all this is kind of hidden down in this particular zip file. So at any instance, if at all I kind of crash my system for some instance, or say hard disk failure, and I bring up a new instance of Jenkins, I can kind of use the backup plugin for restoring this particular configurations. So how do I do that? I just come back to my manage Jenkins, come back to backup manager, and I will say restore Hudson or Jenkins configuration.
Hi guys, welcome to this video on Jenkins interview questions and answers. Jenkins is a popular DevOps open source automation server. It is used to automate the non-human part of software development and supports continuous integration and continuous delivery. Jenkins is a server-based system that runs in servlet containers such as Apache Tomcat. We have compiled the most important Jenkins interview questions that you might face in a Jenkins or DevOps interview. So without further ado, let us get started with Jenkins interview questions and answers.
So the first question you'll be asked about with Jenkins is explain a master-slave architecture of Jenkins. So the way that Jenkins is set up is that the Jenkins master will pull code from your remote Git repository such as GitHub and will check that repository every time there is a code commit. It will distribute the workload of that code and the tests that need to be applied to that code to all of the Jenkins slaves. And then on request, the Jenkins master and the slaves will then carry out all the builds and tests to be able to produce test reports. The next question you'll be asked is, what is a Jenkins file? And simply put, a Jenkins file is a text file that has a definition of the Jenkins pipeline and is checked into a source code repository. And this really allows for three distinct things to happen. One, it allows for a code review and iteration of the pipeline. It permits an audit trail for that pipeline and also provides a single source of truth for the pipeline, which can be viewed and edited. So which of the following commands runs Jenkins from the command line? Is it java-jar jenkins.war, java-war jenkins.jar, java-jar jenkins.jar, java-war jenkins.war? And the answer is A, java-jar jenkins.war. So when working with Jenkins, you're going to be asked what are the key concepts and aspects of working with a Jenkins pipeline. And you want to really hold out your fingers here and go through four key areas, and that is pipeline, node, step, and stage. So pipeline refers to the user-defined model of a CD continuous delivery pipeline. Node are the machines which are part of that Jenkins environment within the pipeline. Step is a single task that tells Jenkins what to do at that particular point in time. And then finally, stage defines a conceptually distinct subset of tasks performed through the entire pipeline. And tasks could be build, test, and deploy. So which of the following file is used to define dependency in Maven? And do we have A, build.xml, B, pom.xml, C, dependency.xml, or D, version.xml? And the answer is pom.xml. Working with Jenkins, you're going to be asked to explain the two types of pipeline used in Jenkins along with the syntax. And so a scripted pipeline is based on Groovy script as the domain-specific language for Jenkins. And there are one or more node blocks that are used throughout the entire pipeline. On the left-hand side, you can actually see what the actual script would look like, and the right-hand side shows what the actual declaration for each section of that script would be. The second type of Jenkins pipeline is a declarative pipeline. And a declarative pipeline provides a simple and a friendly syntax to define what the pipeline should look like. And then you can actually, at this point, use an example to actually break out how blocks are used to define the work completed in a declarative pipeline. So how do you create a copy and backup of Jenkins? Well, to create a backup, periodically back up Jenkins to your Jenkins home directory, and then create a copy of that directory. It's really as simple as that. A question you'll be asked as well is how can you copy Jenkins from one server to another? Well, there are three ways to do that. One is you can move a job from one installation of Jenkins to another by copying the corresponding job directory. The second would be to create a copy of an existing job directory and making a clone of that job directory but with a different name. And the third is to rename an existing job by renaming a directory. So security is fundamental to all the work that we do within DevOps, and Jenkins provides the center core to all the work that gets completed within a DevOps environment. There are three ways in which you can apply security to authenticate users effectively. And when you are asked about this question of security within Jenkins, the three responses you want to be able to provide is A, Jenkins has its own internal database that uses secured user data and user credentials. B is you can use a LDAP or lightweight directory access protocol server to be able to authenticate Jenkins users. Or C, you can actually configure Jenkins to authenticate by using such as OAuth, which is a more modern method of being able to authenticate users. You're going to be asked how to deploy a custom build of a core plugin within Jenkins. And essentially, the 4 steps that you want to go through are, first of all, copying the .hpi plugin file into the Jenkins home plugins subdirectory. You want to remove the plugin's development directory if there is one. You want to create an empty file called plugin.hpi.pinned. And once you've completed these 3 steps, restart Jenkins and your custom build plugin should be available. How can you temporarily turn off Jenkins security if the administrative user has locked themselves out of the admin console? Well, this doesn't happen very often, but when it does, it's good to know how you can actually get into Jenkins and be able to resolve the problems of authenticating effectively into the system as an administrator. So when you want to be able to get into a Jenkins environment, what you want to be able to do is locate the config file. You should see that it's set to true, which allows for security to be enabled. If you then change the user security setting to false, security will be disabled, allowing you to make your administrative changes and will not be re-enabled until the next time Jenkins is restarted. So what are the ways in which a build can be scheduled and run in Jenkins? Well, there are 4 ways in which you can identify the way a build can be scheduled and run in Jenkins. The first is when source code management commits new code into the repository. You can run Jenkins at that point. The second can be after the completion of other builds. So maybe you have multiple builds in your project that are dependent to each other, and when so many other builds have been executed, then you can have Jenkins run. You can schedule builds to run at a specified time. So you may have nightly builds of your code that illustrate the changes in the solution you're building. And then finally, you also can manually build an environment on request. Occasionally, you will want to also restart Jenkins. And so it's good that when a question around how do you restart Jenkins manually comes up, that you have the answers. And there are 2 ways in which you can do it. One is you can force a restart without waiting for builds to complete by using the Jenkins URL that you have for your environment /restart, or you can allow all running builds to complete before restart are required, and in which case you would use the command of the URL for your Jenkins environment /safe restart.
So before we talk about Selenium, let's understand a few drawbacks of manual testing. Let's take an example of a very simple use case. As a user, I want to log in to my web application using username and password. A very simple use case, and it's a very common use case for any kind of web application you're working. So as a tester, what do? I need to write multiple test cases to test this use case. So I can use multiple data sets like valid credentials, invalid credentials, null values, and so on to test this particular use case. And then what you do, you start executing the test cases one by one. You find bugs, then your developers fixes them, and then you will need to rerun all the test cases again and again until all the bugs for this use case are fixed and your application is ready to ship. Now look into this. Now this brings us to the first demerit of the manual testing, which is what? If one has to run test cases with 100 transactions and repeat them again and again, this is going to be a very time consuming process and very boring. Also, it is more error prone since it's done manually and human mistakes are bound to happen. The third challenge is the scope of manual testing itself is very limited. For example, say regression testing. Ideally, you would want to run all the test cases which you have written, but since it's a manual process, this is going to be very tedious to do. And also, you would not have all the luxury of time to execute all test cases. So what do? You start picking up those test cases which are very important to be run. And that way, you are kind of limiting the scope of your testing. Also, working with large amount of data manually is going to be impractical. What about performance testing? You want to collect metrics on various performance measures as a part of your performance testing. You want to simulate multiple loads on your application under test. And all these things, manually, it is very difficult to perform. And it's not feasible also. And to sum it all this, creating manual test reports after running all the tests. Who wants to really do that? And again, another level of challenge here is, say if you're working on an agile model where code is being churned out by developers, the testers are building their test cases, executing them as and when the builds are available to them. This happens iteratively, and hence you will need to run all those test cases which you have written multiple times during your development cycle. And doing this manually definitely is going to be very tedious and boring. And is this the effective of doing it? No. So what do? We automate it. So this tells us why we want to automate. 1, for faster execution. 2, to be less error prone. 3, to help frequent execution of our tests. So there were many tools available in the market for automation. One such tool was Selenium, and that brings us to the slide, Advent of Selenium. So much before Selenium, there were various tools in the market like RFT, QTP, just to name a few popular ones. So Selenium was introduced by a gentleman called Jason Huggins way back in 2004. He was an engineer at ThoughtWorks. He was kind of working on a web application which needed frequent testing, and he realized the inefficiency in doing manual testing of his application repeatedly. So what he did was he wrote a JavaScript program that automatically controlled the browser actions, and then he named that as JavaScript Test Runner. He made this open source, which was later renamed as Selenium Core, and this is how the Selenium came into existence. So with this brief history of Selenium, let's understand what is Selenium and what are its main features. Selenium is the most popular and widely used automation tool for automating web applications. It enables us to test web application on different kind of browsers like Internet Explorer, Chrome, Firefox, Safari, Opera, and so on. And also they introduced support for Edge browser after Microsoft introduced it. Selenium is a set of tools and libraries to facilitate automation of web application. It is not a single tool. It has multiple components, and those we will be seeing in some time. All these tools together help us test the web application. So Selenium is open source and it is platform independent. This is the biggest reason why people are preferring this tool, because it is free of cost. QTP and RFT, which I just talked about, are a chargeable one. Selenium scripts can run on any platform because Selenium is primarily developed in JavaScript. So it is platform independent. Well, as you know, it's common for manual testers not to have in-depth programming background. So Selenium has a record and replay back tool called the Selenium IDE, which can be used to create a set of actions as a script and to replay that script. But this is mainly used for demo purpose. Why? Because Selenium is such a powerful tool that you should be able to take advantage of all its features and not just be with a record and replay tool, right? So that way there are a lot of record and replay tool anyway available in the market. The Selenium provides support for different programming language, Java, Python, C#, Ruby, PHP, and so on. You can write your test scripts in any language you prefer or you like. And again, as I said, one need not really know in-depth or advanced knowledge of these languages. You would still be able to write the Selenium scripts with a basic knowledge of this programming language. And also Selenium supports various operating systems. You can run Selenium test on Windows, Mac, or Linux, or even say if you have a Ubuntu machine, you can always run your Selenium test on Ubuntu machines. So you can run the test on any platform of your choice. Okay, so let's go now a little more deeper into Selenium. So I said that Selenium is not a single tool, but it is a suite of tools, right? So now let's look at what are those major components which comprises of the Selenium suite. First one is the Selenium IDE. So Selenium IDE is the most simplest tool in the whole suite of the Selenium. It is nothing but it's an integrated development environment. Earlier, this IDE was simply a Firefox extension and it offered a record and playback functionality. It was a very simple and easy to use. And as I said, mainly this is used for prototyping or for only the demo purposes, right? And not creating automation for your real-time projects because of its own limitation of being a simple record and replay tool. However, Selenium, what happened? Selenium IDE, it died with Firefox 55. So that means the support for IDE was stopped from Firefox 55 version. But the good news is very recently brand new Selenium IDE has been launched. And also what they have done is they have made this cross browser. That means you can install the extension on Chrome, the IDE extension on Chrome, or as an add-on on Firefox. So it is supported on both the browsers, Firefox and Chrome. Alright, so while we are talking of this IDE, let me also show you how the latest IDE on the Chrome looks. Okay, for that, let me go and launch my Chrome browser. So let me just open a new tab, and what I'll do is I'll search for Selenium IDE for Chrome download. Then I go to this website, and then you can see here Selenium IDE offered by seleniumhq.org. So what I simply need to do is, like you install any extension on your Chrome browsers, I just say add to Chrome, and this adds this extension on your Chrome browser. Now it has added. So Selenium IDE has been added to Chrome. Use this extension by clicking this icon. So can you see this icon here, which is Selenium IDE? That's it. So once you have installed this, you are free to start using the IDE on this Chrome browser. Similarly, you can do adding of this add-on, which is called as add-on on Firefox. So go to the Firefox browser, search for the Selenium IDE and just install that add-on. So let's get back to our presentation. So that's about the IDE. So what's our next component? Our next component is Selenium RC, which is nothing but Selenium Remote Control. Selenium RC is used to write web application tests in different programming languages. It interacts with the browser with the help of RC server. It has an RC server through which only it can interact with the web browsers. And how does it communicate? It uses a simple HTTP GET and POST request. And this is what was called as Selenium 1.0 version. But it got deprecated in 2.0 version and it was completely removed in 3.0 and was replaced with something called as WebDriver. So we will be talking in detail about why this happened, what were the drawbacks of RC which led to replacing with the WebDriver. So now that brings us to the third component, which is the Selenium WebDriver. This is the most important component. It is just a programming interface to create and execute our test cases. Of course, it's a successor of RC because there were certain drawbacks which I just mentioned, and we will be going in detail of what it were. So WebDriver, what the major difference what we see with the WebDriver is the architecture of the WebDriver is much simpler than RC for the reason that WebDriver interacts with the browser directly, unlike your RC where it needs an RC server to interact with the browser. So this gave a lot of advantage and edge over the RC. The fourth component, Selenium Grid. Selenium Grid is used to run multiple test scripts on multiple machines at the same time. With Selenium driver, you can only do the sequential execution. However, in real-time environment, you know that there is always a need to run tests on distributed environment. For example, Say you have a web application and say you have automated around hundreds or thousands of test cases and you need to run them as a regression suite. And also one of the ask is that you need to run this on multiple browsers and multiple OS. Why? Since you have automated them and your application supports multiple browsers and OS. Now imagine the time taken to run these 1,000 test cases sequentially with the WebDriver, right? It's going to take quite a bit of time. So what you need is to run this parallel on multiple machines, matrixed across the browsers and operating system. And that is where the grid helps you in achieving that. So grid has this hub and node concept and it helps in achieving the parallel execution, which I just talked about. So you can check out our detailed video on Selenium Grid on Simplilearn. Alright, so now we talked about the components of the Selenium. So let's look at the different versions it evolved into. So when I talked about RC, I mentioned that this was Selenium 1 version. So now let's understand how this evolved over years and what it offers today. So when Jason Huggins introduced Selenium, the tool was called JavaScript program. He called it as JavaScript test runner. It had one major issue. Now that is something called as same origin policy. So what is the same origin policy? It says that a JavaScript, when executed in a domain, can access web pages in that domain only, and it cannot access any web pages in another domain. I will repeat it. Same origin policies dictates that a JavaScript is executed in a domain can access web pages in that domain only, and it cannot access web pages in another domain. For example, say every web page in say google.com domain like search, email, drive can be accessible, but nothing outside of google.com, like say if you want to access a web page in say Amazon or Yahoo, is possible to access. Why? Because of the simple reason, which is a security reasons. Now to overcome this, Paul Homan created something called a Selenium remote control server. And why did he create that? He wanted to trick the browser in believing that the Selenium core through which you're going to run your scripts and your web application under test are in the same domain, with which you are able to run your test on your web application without having to get into this issue of same origin policy. So this is what was a version 1 of Selenium, and we called it as Selenium remote control. And then what happened in 2007, Simon Stewart, he invented this WebDriver. Now why did he invent this? Because the architecture of Selenium RC was little complicated. RC required a separate server to talk to your browsers. So what he did was he removed the requirement of having a separate server in the RC, and this was the Selenium 2 version. Now since it was a transition phase, both the Selenium RC and the WebDriver coexisted in Selenium 2, while the WebDriver was still under development. And then what happened in 3.0 Selenium is the Selenium core, which is the RC, was completely deprecated and only the WebDriver was made available. So in this series of videos, we will be working with Selenium 3.0. And now Selenium 4 is already around the corner. So alpha is already released as of the day when this video was made, and I believe some of the features what the Selenium 4 is going to offer is they are moving towards W3C WebDriver standardization 1, and also there is going to be an improved IDE, the IDE which I just talked about, that it's a improved version of the previous IDE, and then an improved version of Selenium Grid also. So they might be doing a GUI based grid, right? So these are some of the major features expected in this version. Why Selenium WebDriver? So let's look at what led to replacement of Selenium RC with this WebDriver. For that, first we need to understand the Selenium RC and its shortcomings. As I said, Selenium RC is a simple tool to write tests for web applications in various supported programming languages like Java, Python, Ruby, and C#. And this is the architecture of the Selenium RC at a very high level. First, you need to write test scripts in any of the supported languages of your choice. So if you're more familiar with Java, you would be writing your test scripts, all your commands in the Java language. So before we start writing the test, one of the major required for the RC to run is your RC server. So first you need to start this RC server before you run even a single line of code. And this RC server is a separate application. And now what is the function of this RC server? This Selenium server or the RC server is responsible for receiving Selenese commands from your test script. It interprets them and then reports the result back to your Selenium test script. Now what are the Selenese commands? These commands are nothing but the commands written in your test script. These are called as Selenium command. That is what the Selenium server does. Now, after the Selenium server's function, let's look at how the browser interaction happens. The browser interaction happens through this RC server. This RC server uses a simple HTTP post and get request to communicate. And how does this communication happen? This RC server acts like a proxy. Say for example, your test scripts asks for launching a browser. This command from your test script goes to the server, and then this RC server launches the browser, injects its JavaScript into the browser. Once this is done, all the subsequent calls, that is all the subsequent calls is all the rest of the commands which you have written after launching the browser, go to this RC server and then to the actual web server. So it routes, all the commands are getting routed through your RC server to your web browser. Upon receiving this instruction, so what does the code do? It executes these commands as the JavaScript commands on your browser. So once these are executed, the response from the browser or the results, what you say, are sent back to the RC server, and RC server is responsible for sending it back to your test script. And then the test results are displayed here. Now, if you see this complete cycle from starting your command from your test script, talking to the RC server, then RC server talks to the web browser, it injects the JavaScript here, runs your command, takes back the results, sends it to RC server, and then back to this test script. This whole cycle gets repeated for every command which is written in your test script. And this is how your test case gets executed. All right. So now everything is fine. So great. We are enabled to run the scripts. We are able to launch the browser. We are able to execute all the commands. So what was the problem here? Why was still RC not good enough? For the reason why the RC was still not good enough was, one, the architecture of RC is very complicated because of that intermediate RC server to communicate with the browser. So there is no direct interaction with the browser. This RC server needs to be installed before running any test scripts. That means it has an additional setup, because that is RC server is a mediator between your Selenium commands and your browser. The execution of the commands takes very long time. It is very slow. Why? Because we saw that every command written in your test scripts needs to make a full trip from your test script to the RC server, to the core, to the browser, and then back, which makes your overall automation test execution very, very slow. So how does Selenium WebDriver now overcomes this? This is a simple architecture of Selenium WebDriver. Even in WebDriver, we have test scripts. We have a web browser and a web server. However, we do not have an additional server for communication like the RC server, which we saw in the Selenium RC. This makes the architecture of WebDriver very simple. The Selenium WebDriver, that's one of the biggest advantages. The Selenium WebDriver does not use an additional server. Then secondly, it makes direct calls to your browser using your browser's native support automation. So since there is no intermediate server there, the browser is controlled directly from the operating system level itself. Now, due to this direct communication, the trips what we saw from the RC server to the browser and from the browser back to the RC server and to the test scripts, right? This was an indirect communication. Since this whole thing was avoided, the speed of test execution is much faster in RC. And this overall architecture of the WebDriver, if you see, is much, much simpler than what the RC provides. So this was the major drawback from the RC, and this is where WebDriver replaced RC. Now, was that all because of the architecture? No, there were few other shortcomings with the RC. APIs in Selenium RC. A single function has several commands. Redundant and confusing APIs. RC is less object-oriented API. Though there are good set of APIs to work with, they are pretty redundant and confusing. For example, how and when to use a type key or a type command. Another example is the mouse commands. Click or to use click at, or when to use mouse at or mouse down. So this was getting pretty confusing for the developers. And to top it all this, every browser interprets the command differently, which makes your test cases brittle when it has to work on the multiple browsers. Developers had a tough time making their scripts cross-browser, and they had to add browser-specific code. Whereas Selenium driver comes with a set of more matured and simpler APIs which are pretty straightforward to use. For example, a simple click to simulate a click action on any web element. Send keys, which simply means send the text to any web element on your web page. Scroll up or down on the web page, and so on. So we will see more of this commands when we actually start working with the WebDriver. Another difference is the browser support. Though both RC and WebDriver supports multiple browsers, RC does not have support for HTML unit, which is a headless browser, whereas the WebDriver supports testing on headless browser. Now, what is this headless browser? Headless browser is a browser which does not have a UI. It makes testing much faster because it does not need a real browser for testing. Now, to summarize all this, so if you look at the RC and the WebDriver comparison, which we talked about, RC is a complex architecture, whereas WebDriver has a simple architecture, for the main reason that WebDriver removed the need of having an intermediate server. RC, the execution of your test cases or your automation scripts, it's much slower than the WebDriver. RC requires a RC server to interact with the browser, whereas the Selenium WebDriver interacts with the browser directly using the WebDrivers. Also, we saw the APIs which RC provides, which are pretty confusing, and WebDrivers, we have much easier and easy to use APIs. No support for HTML unit browser, which is a headless browser. Selenium driver also provides support for HTML unit browser. Now that we have understood what Selenium RC is and why WebDriver replaced RC, let's go another level deeper into WebDriver. So what is Selenium WebDriver? We know that the WebDriver in its simplest term is a tool or a programming interface to create and execute test cases on a web application. It supports multiple browsers, i.e. Firefox, Chrome, Opera, Safari, Edge, and it also has support for headless browser. So we will know in some time what is a headless browser. Some of the features of WebDriver. So while RC was introduced in 2004, WebDriver got introduced by Simon Stewart in 2006. WebDriver can run on any platform of your choice, Linux, Windows, Mac, and even if you have a Ubuntu machine, you can run your Selenium WebDriver. And what is this actual WebDriver? Is it an IDE? No, it is a simply a programming interface to run your test cases. And how does it work? The test cases are created and executed using web elements or the objects using web locators and WebDriver methods. So once we get into the demo or once you start understanding how Selenium works, you will understand what are these WebDriver methods and the locating techniques which are used to perform these actions on web element. Selenium WebDriver is pretty fast. Why? Since the WebDriver interacts directly with the browser and does not have an intermediate server like RC. Each browser with which you want to work with has its own driver on which your application runs. And this driver is responsible to make the browser understand the command which are being passed from your script, like a click of button or entering some text in any of the input fields. Through your scripts, you tell which browser you want to work with. Say you want to do all this action, say on the Chrome browser. If you want to work with Chrome browser, then the Chrome driver is responsible for interpreting your instructions from your test case and executing them on the web application, which is launched on Chrome browser only. So like RC, WebDriver also supports multi-programming languages in which you can write your test scripts, like the ones which are listed here. Also, WebDriver supports different frameworks like TestNG, JUnit, and NUnit. When we talk about the limitations of WebDriver, you will appreciate how this support for various frameworks and tools help in making the Selenium a complete automation solution for web application. Now let's try to know what is the architecture of Selenium WebDriver. WebDriver has 4 different components in it. One, we have the client libraries, or what is also called as language binding. Since I said Selenium supports multiple languages and you're free to use any of the supported languages to create your automation script, there are libraries available on Selenium website which you need to download and use them. Let me show you that. So let's go to my Chrome browser. So I have the Selenium HQ website already launched here. So guys, if you're working on Selenium, this website seleniumhq.org is going to be Bible. So everything and whatever you need to know and work with Selenium is available here. For now, we want to see the client libraries or the language binding. So for that, what you need to do is if you go to the download section here, can you see here the Selenium client and WebDriver language binding? So for each of the languages which is supported, you have a client library which you can download from here. So if you're working on Java, you need to download the Java libraries. If you're working on Python, you need to download the Python libraries, right? So these are called as language bindings. So Selenium provides a lot of APIs for us to interact with the browsers. And when we do the demo, I will be showing some of those APIs. Now, what are these APIs? These APIs are the REST APIs. REST is representational stateful APIs, and everything for Selenium happens through this REST calls. The second component is the JSON wire protocol. So what is JSON? JavaScript object notation, and it's a standard for exchanging data over the web. So for example, you want to launch a web application through your script. So what Selenium does is it creates a JSON payload and posts the request to the browser driver, right? And where are these browser drivers? These are here. Right? And what are these browser drivers? These are a driver specific to each browser. So if you see here, you can see drivers for Chrome, Firefox, Opera, Safari, and Edge, right? So we interact with the actual browsers here using these drivers. And how does this happen? This driver establishes connection with the real browser without revealing the internal logic of browser functionality, right? That's exactly the function of this browser driver. Now, what does that mean? Let's say we want to execute a test script. So what happens when the script is executed is an HTTP request is generated and sent to browser driver for each command in the script. And then the driver receives the request through this HTTP server and does all the execution on the actual browser. Once the execution is done, the execution results are just sent back over the same HTTP server to your test scripts. So this is the simplest form of the architecture of the Selenium WebDriver. Well, now as every tool has its own advantages and its limitations, so let's look at what Selenium WebDriver limitations are. Cannot test mobile applications, requires framework like APM. Selenium is for automating web application. It cannot handle mobile. Right? Mobile applications are different and they have its own set of automation tools. However, what Selenium provides is the support for integrating this APM tool. APM tool is one of the popular tool for mobile application automation, right? So it provides a support for integrating APM tool. So using APM and Selenium, you can still achieve mobile application automation. Now, when do you usually use this? In cases where, say, your application under test is also supported on mobile devices. So that means you need a mechanism to run your test cases on your web browser as well as your mobile browsers, right? And this is how you achieve it using Selenium. When we talked about components of Selenium, I said that the WebDriver can achieve only sequential execution. But in real time, we know that we just cannot live with this. We need to have a parallel execution on multiple machines and on multiple browsers. So this limitation of WebDriver is replaced by having the grid, which helps us in achieve the parallel execution. And do check out our video on more details on Selenium Grid. Selenium WebDriver has limited reporting capability. It can help create basic reports, but definitely we need more, especially when we are working on a big project. We need good reports to be created. So what it does is we have a support for multiple tools like TestNG, ReportNG, and even the extent reports, which you can integrate with Selenium and generate beautiful reports. Isn't it really powerful? Alright, there's another challenge what we have. These are amongst few of the challenges what I have put across here. There are other challenges also, but always there is a workaround to get through those challenges. So another challenge which we have mentioned here is Selenium is not very good with image testing, especially designed for web application automation. But then we have other tools which can be used along with Selenium to achieve any kind of image testing you want to do, like AutoIt and Securely. So same way, the way it provides a mechanism to integrate APM, so Selenium also provides a way for integrating AutoIt and the Securely tools. So if you look at all this, Selenium still provides a complete solution for our automation need. And that's the beauty of Selenium that makes it most powerful tool today for automation. Okay, so let's look at WebDriver in action. So before we do that, let's understand some of the basic browser commands and functions that we will be using in our demo today. The get commands. So there are 6 get commands to perform various actions on the browser. Driver.get. This is used to launch any website application. It takes a string argument and this needs to be a fully formed URL which you want to launch. Driver.getTitle. So this method fetches the title of the web page which you're working with. So for example, let's go to eBay. So if you just hover your mouse here, can you see the text there? Electronics, cars, fashion, collectibles, coupons and more, eBay. So this is nothing but title of this current page. And this command helps us to get the title. Get current URL. So to get the URL of any page is when you want to use this command. So this will be used especially when you're working with multiple web pages and you want to say print whatever the current URL you're working on the console. Get page source. This method dumps the complete HTML page source on your console. Actually, this is not really much used unless you really need to look at anything in your HTML pages. And then there are two more get commands related to Windows handles. These are used for handling multiple tabs and multiple windows on the browser. Now, we will not be dealing with this in today's demo. However, if you want to know the details of this command, these are available in our video tutorials for these commands. The next set of commands are the navigational commands. So these are self-explanatory and basically are used to navigate between the multiple pages of your web application. The first one, the driver.navigate.to, is very similar to driver.get. So both does the same function. And then you have navigate.back, navigate.forward, and navigate.refresh. So this is used for refreshing your browser page. And then there are two commands, browser commands, which we use. One is the driver.close. So this closes the current browser window. So if you have got multiple tabs open in the window and you want to close a particular tab, so that is when you use driver.close. And driver.quit, what it does, it quits the entire browser session. Then there are few other commands, and some of the commands are listed here. However, if you see, there is a huge list of commands available in Selenium, and since we'll be using just a few of them in today's demo, I have listed here. So let's just understand these very basic commands which we will be using. Driver.findElement. Now, when you want to work with any application, what is that you need to do? You need to perform actions on the elements of the web page, and these are called as web elements. For example, let's go to our ebay.in. So on this website, say you want to search for JBL speakers. And what do you do when you want to search for this? You would identify the search box and you will enter the text JBL speakers, right? And then you go ahead and click on the search button. So this is the set of operations which you will do. Now for us to write this, and this is exactly what you need to do through your commands. For us to really write this text as JBL speakers, I need to know what this particular element is. Okay, so this particular input box is my web element which I need to identify. Similarly, if I want to click on the search button, I need to identify what this button is. And that's exactly is done by using driver.findElement. Selenium has multiple ways of finding these elements. It has 8 element locating techniques. And our future videos on Selenium do cover these 8 element locating techniques very much in detail. So for us, right now we'll be using couple of them. So one is with ID and one is with a link text. The next one, the send keys. So as the name indicates, it is used to send a certain text to any web element you have identified or you want to work with. Like in this example, as I said, since we want to search for JBL speakers, right? I would be basically sending the text JBL speakers to this web element using send keys. Click. So after entering the text, what we need to do, I said, we need to click on the search button. So for all such actions, we have methods defined in Selenium. And one of them is this click. What this does is it just clicks on the web element or the button which we want to work with. So now with these basic commands, let's go ahead and start writing our code for our test case. So what is the test case we are going to write today? So this is my use case today. So use case 1, as a user, I want to log into eBay application, search for JBL speakers, and then I want to check the today's deal. So there is something called as the day's deal. We will go and click on that and see what are the deals available. I have another use case here. What says is, from this website, from wherever we are, right, navigate to the Simplilearn website and navigate back to the ebay.in. So this, using this use case 2, what I want to show you is how do we use the navigational commands. And my third use case is, from the ebay.in, I want to print the page title and close the browser. So with this, we are trying to demonstrate at least few commands from each of the categories which we talked about. So I will be using Eclipse for writing our test scripts. And if you want to know how to get started with Selenium, how do we install Selenium, you can refer to our videos on installation of Selenium by Simplilearn. Okay, let me go to my Eclipse. So in Eclipse, what I have done is I have already created a project called Selenium Demo. And in this project, I've gone ahead and created a Java class in which we would be writing our test case. So the Java class which I have created is ebaysearch.java. And also what I have done is, if you look at few import statements here, I have imported all the required Selenium jars here. So if you look here in the referenced libraries, the way after we work with Java here, right? So Java is the prereq for your Eclipse. So you already have the Java libraries available here. So what I need to do is I also need to import the Selenium jar files, and this is the list of Selenium jar files which you will need to work with the Selenium, and this I've already imported for you. Then another thing what I do as following a best practice is, instead of writing all my code under this main function here, what I do is I create methods for each of the use case or the test case which I'm writing. So same thing, I'm going to do that today for all the use cases which we have taken for this demo. Now let's get started. So what is the first thing which we need to do? The first thing what we need to do is you need to declare your WebDriver. So which I've already done here. I've said WebDriver driver. And then I need to launch the browser before even I go into ebay.in and start performing the other testing. Now for me to launch browser, this is one method which I've already written here. So let me walk you through this. So there are multiple steps we need to follow for launching the browser. The first thing is set system property. So let's understand this particular command here, the one which I have highlighted. So this is used to set the property for your Gecko driver. Now, what is a Gecko driver? If you remember, while we are talking of WebDriver architecture, I said for whichever browser you want to work with, you need to tell the WebDriver as which browser is what you're going to test with. And in my case here, I'm going to be using Firefox browser. And also, if you remember, while explaining the architecture, I said every browser has its own driver which you need to download and install. And where is this driver? Let's go ahead and see that on the seleniumhq.org. So let me go to my Chrome browser. I already have a seleniumhq.org website open here. Now on this website, in the download section, if you go down, you can see something called as third-party drivers, binding and plugins. And here you would see a list of all browsers, Gecko driver, Chrome, Opera, Edge, right, and HTML unit, which is headless browser. So all these browsers which Selenium supports listed. And for each of this browser, we have a driver associated with it, which we can download. So if I want a Gecko driver, what I need to do is I need to click on this latest link. This will take me to the latest web driver which is available. So depending on the operating system which you're using, right now I'm using a Mac, so I've already downloaded it. So once you download, you need to place it in a particular directory.